Right, so I've finished off my UVs or I've almost finished off my UVs. I just want to show the last few steps of doing this. That's the UV layout there. So everything's quite nice and neat, and I've taken up as much space in 0 to 1 as I could. There's just one thing that I need to do before I can bake this down, which is I need to make sure that none of my UVs are overlapped. So for example, this UV here, or this bit of texture on the bottom, the inside bottom, is the same as that piece there that's on the underside. So what I need to do is just to choose one of those that I want to bake, and the other one I'm just going to move it off to the side. So I'm going to bake this one. I'm going to bake the inside because I think you're going to see that more often than the outside. So what I'll do is I'll take this shell here on the outside, and if you hit this little box in the corner, in the bottom left hand corner of the UVs where it says absolute or relative type-ins, if you put that in so it's highlighted and then just type 1 into the U, it'll move exactly 1 UV space off to the right. So actually that is still on top of that. It's just that when this bakes, it's only going to bake what's in that space, but when you texture it, whatever you put in this bit of texture will go exactly onto that piece. So I think there's one other bit, which is these pieces here. So again, I'm just going to choose to bake that one and not this one. So I'm going to get these pieces, which are the same as those pieces in there, and I'm going to move them off 1 to the right. And then just to double check, in fact there is another piece, because there's this bottom piece here. So that piece there also needs moving off 1 to the right, and that should be everything that was overlapped. But just to make sure, I will go to select. So with the poly tool selected, I'll go to select and I'll do select overlapped polys, and provided nothing comes up, nothing highlights, then you're good to go. Okay, so the next thing to do is to get this ready for the actual bake, and we're going to need 2 slightly different models. One that is exploded for the normal matte bake, and one that isn't for the AO bake. So I'll explain what exploding is in a second when we get to that bit, but for now I've got my high poly on another layer, so I can just hide that on and off. So for now I will make it unhidden so I can see it. I'm going to collapse that UV edit down and select my low poly, and what I want to do is to put a projection modifier on. So I'll just hit projection, or you can find projection in the modifier list there, and I want to say what I'm projecting to, or projecting from. So I'm projecting from the high poly, so I'm going to go pick and then just click on the high poly. So now we've got that high poly model in there. That I've just called that high poly. It doesn't know that it's the high poly, it's just the name that it's been given. Then what I like to do is to come down to cage and turn shaded on, because that makes it a bit easier to see what you're doing. Okay, so once we've got shaded on, you can see there's little bits like this where the high poly is just poking through that low poly cage. That's going to cause a error in the bake. So we need to make sure that this blue cage is pushed outside and is completely outside of the high poly. To do that, all we need to do is just push it. So just grab that spinner, move it up until it's pushed outside. What you want to do with this is you want to push things as little as you possibly can but make sure that you've pushed them enough to completely encompass the high poly model. So I think I'm okay. It's just a piece there that's not quite pushed. So what you can do is you can go into vertex mode and you can move the verts on these cages, on this cage, just manually. I really strongly recommend you don't ever do that. If you find a time when you need to do that, what you probably need to do is go back and alter your low poly model to be closer to the high poly model. It's just bad practice to move these individually. It makes it really hard to, if you ever have to rebake, it means you have to do all of that again. It can be hard to remember what you had to do. It's time consuming. It's just bad practice. But I think that's okay. I'm actually going to bake this in XNormal, but what I am going to do is I'm just going to do test bake in 3ds Max to make sure that I've not got any, whether my cage is complete covering it. So what I need to do is go to render texture, which is 0 on the keyboard. Then I can choose which folder I want to put it in. Okay, so I'm going to save it into that folder. And let's have a look at these settings. So if we go into render settings and go to setup, I don't think we should have to do anything in here. You can turn, if you want to do a bake from 3ds Max, you can turn these things on. We're doing it in XNormal, so as this is a test, it doesn't really matter. We want to make sure that well, we can turn padding off for now as well. We want to make sure that projection mapping is enabled, because that's what we're doing, we're projecting from the high poly to the low poly. You can come into options here. For now we want to make sure that ray mist check is on. What that'll do is it'll highlight in red any areas that our cage isn't covering, and all we're doing at the moment is a test bake to see that that is working. So then we want to add a normal map. We'll change the size of the normal map to, let's say, 1024, just so that we've got a bit of detail and we can see it. And then we can just hit render. And hopefully you should get something that looks a bit like that. What I'll just do quickly to demonstrate this is I'm just going to go in here and I'm going to move my cage in so that it starts to miss some of these things, and then I'm going to render that again, and you can see I'm getting these little red areas where the cage isn't covering it. So if you see any of these, you just need to push your cage out a little bit further. So let's undo that. That's it. Okay, so let's now export these into XNormal to do our, we can use these to do our ambient occlusion. So what we need to do is, in order to export this into XNormal, we need it to be an editable mesh as opposed to an editable poly that it is now. So if you just go down to your editable poly, click yes, that's fine, and then put an edit mesh modifier on, and then come back to your projection. You can see that's just triangulated that. XNormal just needs it to be like this in order to read the cage data. Now we can go File, Export, Export Selected, and find where you want to export it to. Now, if you have XNormal installed, which is down here somewhere, then you should have in your save as type, you should have a XNormal SBM exporter. If you don't see that, you need to stop this video, go and sort out XNormal, go and install it. It's free to download, so that should be okay. Then what we'll do is we'll just call this low poly or low poly crate or whatever you want to call it. Save that as a .sbm file, and you just want to click on the low definition mesh, and that will export all the options that you need for the low poly mesh. Click export, and you should get the scene was exported successfully, so that's good. Now we'll get our high poly mesh file, export selected, high poly, save that, and this time that's going to be a high definition mesh. This we don't need to be an editable mesh, this can be an editable poly for the high poly one. Click export, that's going to take a little bit longer because it's got more data in it. Okay, close, that's good. So now let's open XNormal. And what we want to do is, first of all, just to make sure that your options are set correctly, if you go to this little plug down here, the plugin manager, open that up and go to tangent basis calculators, and you should find this mic t-space. Click on that and go to configure and make sure that compute binormal in the pixel shader is ticked. If you're exporting to Unreal 4, which is what I'm using most of the time at the moment, then you'll get slightly better results if that's ticked. It's hardly noticeable, but you get a little bit closer to a synced normal in Unreal 4. So just make sure that's ticked. We can shut that down. Then we're going to go to high definition meshes. If you've got something in there, just clear these out of high and low. Right click in there, add mesh, and let's find our mesh. So it's this, that was the high poly, so that's the high poly there. Low definition mesh, add mesh, the low poly. And we want to tick use cage because we already set up the cage, which was that blue thing that we used in the projection modifier. Baking options, let's choose somewhere to save this, so put it in there. Oh, I've already got a folder called that, and this is going to be an AO map. We'll need, in order to do our normal map, we'll need to explode our mesh first, so we're going to make sure that ambient occlusion is ticked, and we'll have a little bit of padding. 2 padding should be enough for the AO. You can put that up to 4 if you want. I'm going to do this at 2048 by 2048 with a mind to my final game ready asset is going to be at 1024 by 1024, so I'm going to bake everything out at double that resolution so that I've got those high resolutions to work on in Photoshop. Then I think we're good to go. Anti-aliasing can be set to 1, that's fine, all this is fine. Hit generate maps, and this is going to take a few seconds, so I'll just pause the video. Okay, so once that's done, you should see something like this, which is essentially our AO is just these shadows baked down onto our UVs. So that looks perfect to me. That looks nice and neat. I can't see any errors in that, so I'm happy with that. And I'll close that down. Okay, the next thing that I need to do is I need to do what is called exploding the mesh. So what I'll do is, first of all, I'm just going to save this as UVs exploded. I'm going to save it as a separate file. There's loads of different ways of doing this. You can use like material IDs. If you want, experiment with different methods and find one that works with you, for you. I tend to just explode the mesh, which is maybe not the fastest way of doing it, but it gives, I kind of understand what I'm doing with that. So what I mean by exploding the mesh is if we look at our, okay, so I've loaded up the AO map that we've just baked. What you're getting in here is, if you look at areas like this, we've got where the bottom of this crate sits on this side piece, we've got some shadows baked into that. So that shadow there is, let's get back to 3ds Max. That shadow there is, let me just put that to realistic. It's this piece here, this strip of metal along the side. So we're also going to have shadows where this strip of metal sits over the top, which you can just see starting to form in there. And you can see here, basically all this has got one piece of geometry projecting onto another piece of geometry. In our normal map, we don't want that. We don't want the shape of this piece of wood here. Let me see if I can find my low poly actually. We don't want the shape of this piece of wood here being altered by this piece of metal along here. So we want to separate them all out, and the way that we do that is, or one way of doing that is by exploding it. So I'm just going to drop that down again to an editable poly, and what I usually do now is put a edit, not an edit mesh, put a edit poly modifier on top. Now we can just take the elements one by one and start to move them out of the way. So I'm going to move this one over here and just hide off my high poly actually. So I'm just moving them so that they're not overlapping each other anymore. Like this. If you move them just in one axis, it makes it easier to line up the high poly after. So rather than kind of moving this, I don't know, like up here or something, just move it directly down or directly to the side. Okay, so that's done. We can turn our edit poly on and off now, and as we turn that on and off, we can still go back to what we originally had. Now we need to get our high poly, and what I'm going to do is just delete all of these elements now that we don't need. So before, when I was doing the ambient occlusion, I wanted those elements because I wanted the shadows baked from one thing to another. Now that we're doing the normal map, I don't want them. Okay, so we've just got those pieces. Let's just make sure that our low poly is exploded, and then let's get our high poly, and then it's just a case of getting these elements and moving them to line up again. So you want to be fairly precise with this. So just take your time, and I'll pause this actually. Okay, so that's done. One thing that I should have done that I didn't think to do, or wasn't thinking right, so I didn't do, was I should have put that into another edit poly modifier as well, but it doesn't really matter. I've saved it as a separate file, so that's fine. So now our low poly and our high poly are matched up again, but nothing's overlapping anymore. So now I can just repeat the process. I can get my low poly, I can put a projection modifier on, I can pick the high poly, oops, not pick list, just pick. I can pick the high poly, I can turn shaded on, and I can make sure that, so I think this was the bit that stuck out most, so as long as that bit goes over I should be okay. So I can bring that out again. We can do test bake, but I'm fairly happy that's going to work. So that's it. Again, now I need to edit mesh on so that I can export that to XNormal. Now file export selected, I'll call that low poly exploded. Terrible writing. And I will select low definition mesh and export that. Then I'm going to take my high poly and export that, and that's high poly exploded. Save that. High definition mesh, export, close. So back to XNormal, clear all these meshes. Let's get my high definition mesh, which this time is high poly exploded. My low definition mesh, which is low poly exploded. And I want to make sure that my cage is turned on again, so use cage. Baking options, this time we're not doing an AO, we're doing a normal map. For my normal map, you just want loads of padding for normal maps, so 16 is probably enough, to be honest, but you can't have too much padding in a normal map, so just turn it right up to 64 or something. This time this one's going to be called normal, although it'll put that suffix on anyway, and with a bit of luck we can just generate the maps, and that looks fine. So let's just put the padding on after. That looks okay. So the last thing to do, or the sort of last step of this, is just to test everything in something like Marmoset. It doesn't really matter, but just make sure that your normal map is looking okay. So shut down XNormal, and what I will do is I'm just going to build my cage. So let's just save this as something else. Let's call it final model or something, and I can delete my high poly out of this now. I can get rid of all of these, back to there, and all I want to do now is just put my mesh together. So that I need one of those. It's going to sit here. Like that. Okay, so I'm just going to go around and turn this back into a full crate. And as I'm doing this, my UVs are staying stacked on top of each other, so I don't need to worry about those. Okay, so here's my crate, and let's export that. So I'm just going to do file export selected. I'm going to export this as a OBJ file. And let's call this crate done or something. This should be our final model, pretty much. That's all fine. Change the faces to polygons. If you set the preset to Mudbox, that usually comes into Marmoset fine. So let's open up Marmoset 2. Okay, so here's Marmoset, and add a mesh. Okay, that's our mesh, that's looking good. Now we just want to add everything to all of our maps that we've baked into our material. So if we click on our material, first thing we'll do is check our normal map. So that is that one. Okay, so when I bring in my normal map, it's going to look wrong and weird, and the reason it looks wrong and weird is because the Y just needs flipping upside down. Different engines, different renderers have Y flipped other ways. You can flip the Z and the X as well in Marmoset. I've never seen anything that has anything other than Y flipped. So if we flip the Y, you should see everything starts to look quite nice now. We've got these nice soft edges, and this is starting to look a lot more like our high poly did. So around here we've got the normal map's working, and it's curving the light to look like that's not actually a hard edge. So if I take the normal map off, you can see that looks exactly how it is in the low poly. There's a right angle between this piece and this piece. If I put my normal map on, it starts to soften that edge. So just go around. It's definitely worth at this point going around and really studying every aspect of your normal map and checking it is working exactly the way that you want. When we talk about synced normals, if your normals are perfectly synced, then this should essentially look identical to the high poly model. Synced normals are, you can rarely get normals synced perfectly, but this is pretty close. Okay, so that's the normal map. What we'll also do is in our albedo, I'm just going to put in the ambient occlusion as well and check that's working. So that's just a little bit of shadow baked in, and you can see as I put that on, it just gives a bit of life and a bit of texture to the model. And this is going to give us a good basis to start our texturing from. So just do all of this bit slow and methodical. Spend some time going around making sure that your bakes are all neat and tidy. All of this stuff is going to help a lot with texturing, and it's a good way to just check that everything's worked correctly up to this point. So that's baking done. The last step is to texture this, and we're going to fill in some more of these. So our albedo map that's in there is going to come down into our occlusion. So we're going to put that into our occlusion map. Then we're going to create an albedo map. We're going to create a microsurface gloss map or a roughness map, and we are going to, instead of creating a specular map, we're going to create a metalness map as well, to make these bits look metal and the wooden bits not look metal. So that will all be in the next video.